Hi there and welcome to this video. During the course of my work, I frequently get requests from customers to perform some kind of irregular data manipulation and data input in Qlikview. And I wanted to share these stories with you, and today is the first one. We're going to cover a few concepts in this video, a few keywords like first, while, mapping and cross table, and a couple of functions, iterno, iteration number, and apply map. So let's just dive right in. Due to security reasons, I wasn't able to use the original data from the customers, but I've managed to reconstruct the scenario using another database. It's called Northwind. It's a free database that is shipped with Microsoft SQL and other programs, and it contains data of an imaginary company. And I'm using a couple of tables from this data, orders and order details. And as you can see, it's a fairly simple structure, just these two tables for now. And it's very simple. What the customer requested was something like this. He told me that he has a table in his layout, and this table is getting exported via macro into a CSV file, which in turn is loaded into handheld devices that is used by agents in the field. And what he needed me to do, he needed me to take each line of this table and duplicate it. Each line will be duplicated a different number of lines based on an input table that the customer will provide. Plus, it will also add an employee ID and details into this into each duplication. And this is the table that the customer supplied me with. Of course, it doesn't cover all the order ID, but it's sufficient for our purposes. And each line contains of employee ID and details, the order ID which is associated with it, and the number of times to duplicate each line. Now, the first thing I'm faced when I'm trying to perform this task is the limitation of Qlikview that in a table box, each line is unique. So if I have 2 or 3 duplicates of the same line, it will still show in the table box as one line. The same goes for a table box, because the aggregation by definition only show one set of values for each aggregate set of dimensions. So again, I will only have one line and not duplicates. And if I want to duplicate the lines, I will need to actually add a new field which will have a different value in each duplication, and this will enable me to duplicate the lines. So let's go into the script and see how we can do this. First, let's just import our input table. This is the input table that the customer has provided me with. It contains these fields, and in order to create new lines, I need some kind of a loop. I need, for each combinations of values, I actually need Qlikview to produce more lines with a different value in each line. To do this, I'm utilizing what is called the while keyword. The while keyword is added at the end of the load statement. And what it does, it actually tells Qlikview to repeatedly read each line when it reads the table. And how many times each line will be repeatedly read is determined by the condition which is supplied into the while statement. And most of the time it uses special functions that Qlikview supplies, which is called iterno, or iteration number, which actually tells Qlikview how many times each iteration has been performed. And for example, if Qlikview reads our input table, and then it starts reading the first line, it reads the first time, and then the value of the iter number will show 1, and the second repetition it will show 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6. And since I want Qlikview to stop when it reaches the number of times which is indicated in the number of time field, all I have to do is just give the condition that read each record while iter number is smaller or equal to the number of time field. And since I don't need it in the table, I can also remove it. And this is actually the condition. And here I'm going to add my new field. And since it's going to divide my duplication, I will just call it divider. And the value for the divider field, I'll again use the iter number function to populate this field, and I'll actually have a duplicated record for each combinations of employee, first name, last name, and order ID, and the new field divider will contain in each line a different number. So let's run this script up until here, and we will see what happens. And as you can see, we have a new table, input 1, and it's connected to the other tables via the order ID. It currently has this number of rows in it, and if I put it here, table box of this new table, then you can see that each line is actually repeated 3 times. Okay, and actually the number of combinations is much larger than the number of rows that contains in this table. Okay, now all I have to do is just add my new fields into the object. We have the employee ID, first name, last name, and our new divider field. Let's put them on top. And if I order it by this column, I can see that I have duplicates for each line, the number of times that was indicated in the number of times field. And since I don't need the divider field to show, I can just go to Presentation tab and tell Qlikview to hide it. And the result is what seems like a table with duplicates of each line, the number of times that is needed. And actually, this is exactly what the customer wanted. So I said, okay, I'm done. Then the customer comes to me and tells me, okay, actually, the input table that I gave you is a manually constructed table. I took the original data and I manually created this table to give you the number of times. But I don't want to need to do the same process again and use a manual stage each time I want a new data to be loaded. So what I want you to do is to go and read the data from the original input table, which is in a different structure, slightly, which was of course an understatement. And this is actually the original table, which is used by the field manager, agent managers, to populate how many times each line should be duplicated. And as you can see, it's in a bit of a different structure. And actually, what I needed to do is to take this data in this table and convert it so it will look like this, in order for me to use the same method I used to duplicate the lines. So let's see how I achieved this task. When you see tables like this from Excel mostly, the first thing that comes to mind is the use of the cross table technique. A cross table is a special technique in Qlikview which enables Qlikview to take an input table and to read each line of input table. And what it does, it takes the columns from the table, takes the column names, and it creates a new field which contains in each row the names from the column labels. And it then creates another field which contains for each column label the value that is in the intersection between the qualifying field, in this case the order ID, and the column that it's underneath it. So in this case I have 15 different columns, and I have one qualifying field. So for each line in the input table I will actually get 15 new lines. Each one will have 2 new columns. One will contain the column names from the original table, and the other will contain the values for each column name from the original table. Now the problem with cross table is that it uses the column labels as the values for the new table, for the new row, for each row in the new table. And my problem is that the customer cannot ensure me that the columns will be the same all the time. Not each time that you will give me the input table, it will be arranged the same employee ID in the same column. So in this case I have employees 3, 5, 8, etc., etc. But tomorrow I can have in this column employee number 20, number 50, number 29, each time a different name. So if I will use the column name and convert it with the cross table, I will actually have to tell Qlikview each time what is the new column name. So this won't work. I need to find a way to dynamically link between the column position and the name of the column, and after performing the cross table, to change the name so it will reflect the exact employee ID that was occupying this certain columns. So what I thought of was actually doing a mapping scenario. And in Qlikview, I don't need this, I can, oops, sorry, I can comment this out. And we'll go to the next stage. First, we will read the new table. And if I look at the new table, I can see that, first of all, I don't need the column labels. So I can just tell Qlikview that I don't going to use embedded labels. I'm not going to use labels at all. And what Qlikview will do, it will use the column number as the column label. One difference though, just to state it, it's if I'm using XLXX Excel file, then instead of the row numbers, the column numbers, Qlikview will use the actual letters from the column. But since for me it's the same, the process can be done the same if it's this one or this one. It doesn't really matter. Another thing I need to do here is I need to tell Qlikview, first of all, I don't need these columns. I can only need the first one and the others. Actually, I don't really need the first one either, but since Qlikview needs at least one qualifier field in the cross table technique, I will have to use this one, and I will drop it later. And we will see what I mean in a second. And another thing that I don't need is I don't actually need this this line, so I can just tell Qlikview that I want it to start reading the data from the first line of data, or the second line in this case. And one other thing I need to do, I just actually need to read this line of data. I don't need to read the rest of the lines. I can do this quite easy if I just, for example, tell Qlikview to read lines where the column 2 field has the value of employee ID in it. But since I know exactly how many lines I need to read, I'm going to use a different technique. and I'm going to utilize the keyword first. The keyword first, when preceding a load statement, tells Qlikview how many lines actually to read from this load statement. And since I only need one, this is going to be enough for me. So let's run the script up until here, and we have a new table. Let's see in the diagram. We have a new table. I haven't named it yet. Do it in a second. And it actually has 16 fields in it. I'll add everything here. And I can see that it has one line, and that it has the column name. The column number as the column name, and the employee ID as the value. Now, what I'm going to do is perform the cross table on this table, and this will give me actually a new table which will have 15 lines, where the first field, #1, will be repeated, and 2 new fields will be added. One will contain the column numbers that are now labeled as values, and the other will contain the employee ID for each column number, and I will name those 2 columns. So let's go into the script and do this. I will first name this table temp1, and this will be temp2, and it's going to load everything from temp1, and after that I don't need table temp1 anymore, so I can just drop it. Now all I have to do is add the cross table statements before it. Cross table actually receives 3 parameters: the names of the 2 new columns. In our case, the first one is column name, and the second one is employee ID. The third parameter actually tells Qlikview how many qualifier fields are in the input table. In this case, I have only one. The original table had a few more, but I only need to read this one, so it doesn't matter. And if you don't supply the third parameter, the default value is 1, so you don't have to supply it. And one other thing that I have to do after I add table here is to drop the field Q1, because I don't need it from the table. And let's run this up until here, and we now have a new table which is called temp2, and it has only 2 fields in it: column name and employee ID. And now I have a way for Qlikview to tell me each time I'm loading the data which employee ID is associated with each column name. So the next load that I will perform, I can have a way of translating the values for each column with the correct employee ID. So all I have to do now is actually read this table again, and I'm going to use it as a mapping table. So I'm going to use the mapping keyword. I'm going to call this table map, and I'm going to load my 2 new fields from this table, resident temp2 table, and drop table temp2 because I don't need it anymore. And what I've done here is actually created a mapping table. A mapping table needs to contain 2 fields only. The names doesn't matter, it's just for convenience. What Qlikview does, it uses the first field as the lookup field, and it uses the second field for the value that it will return, and we will see it later on in the script. And if I run the script now, I am actually back at the original scenario where I have only two tables in the diagram, and Qlikview actually has one more table, which is the mapping table, but it is in memory and Qlikview doesn't show it. So all I have left to do actually is load the actual data that I need. So we'll go again to our input table. And again, I don't need the embedded labels, so I can tell Qlikview to drop it. And this time, I actually need to tell Qlikview that I have more lines that I don't need actually, because my data actually starts on the 4th line. So I can tell Qlikview that these 3 lines are from the header, and I don't need it. And this is actually what I have. So we'll just finish this here. I also don't need these columns, so I will do it like this, and I will rename this column because it now contains the order ID column. Now on this new table, I'm going to do again a cross table. We'll call it temp3. Sorry, we'll call this one temp3, and again we will use a cross table. Again, I will use the same name, column name, for the first field, and the second field this time will contain the actual data from this table, which is actually the number of times I need each row to be duplicated. So we'll just call it num of times. And now I actually have, I will run it up to here, and we'll see what we get. And we actually get a new table. It's called temp3. It has 3 columns in it: the order ID, which connects to the rest of the table, and the column name and number of times to be duplicated for each row. And if I put this new table in a table box, you can see it right here for each order ID. It tells me the column name which is associated with it, and the number of times to put it in to duplicate the lines. And I can see that, for example, some employee IDs have values in 2 order IDs. So it's column 7 that I'll have to duplicate 2 times, and the same order with another user ID, I'll have to duplicate 5 times. So all I need to do now is actually I need to replace the column names with the correct order IDs, employee IDs. So I will have the final table, and this is done by using the mapping table that I've prepared earlier, and using, so I will read again this table. Now it has 3 rows: order ID, column name, and number of times. Resident temp3, drop table temp3 because I don't need it anymore, and we'll call this one temp4 since it's not our last load. And like I said before, I need to change the contents of the column name field values to the actual employee ID. And I use the apply map function in order to do this. The apply map functions, apply map functions accepts two parameters. First of all, it wants to know which mapping table I'm using. So I will tell it I'm using a mapping table called map. The next thing it wants to know is where to take the values to look in the first column of the lookup table, of the mapping table. Remember, I told you the first column is going to be the lookup table, and I wanted Qlikview to take the value from this load column name field and go and look for it in the mapping table. And when it finds it, I want it to return the value in the other field, which is, as you recall, the employee ID. And actually, if I run the script now, I can see that instead of the call name, which doesn't exist anymore, I have a new field called employee ID for each order ID, and this is the correct employee ID for this order ID. If in the next time this data will be read and here there will be employee number 20, then the mapping table will replace it with 20 and not with employee 5. Now all I need to do is add the employee first name and last name. I can do this by joining this information from the employee tables, which is also included. I only need the employee ID and the first name and the last name. I don't need this directory statement. By the way, this directory statement comes from me using the checkbox on the relative paths when I go search for a table. A relative path means that I'm telling Qlikview to search for the file I want, not from the root folder of the drive I'm in, but relatively to the where I'm to the folder that I am now. And what Qlikview does, it adds the, let's see what it did. What Qlikview does, it adds, when I use the relative paths checkbox, it adds the directory statement. So Qlikview will know that this is the default directory, the directory where the Qlikview files, the QVW files is on. I can come here and use the directory and tell it, no, I want the relative paths to be relative to a different directory. And this is why Qlikview automatically adds the directory statement whenever you use the relative paths. And in most cases, since it's the same as not putting the directory, I only need it when I want to use a different relative source for the relative path checkbox. Okay, that was a sidetrack. But I was left joining the employee details for each of the employee ID. And if I run the script now, you can see that I actually have my original table, the one that originally the customer was supplying me, this table with the employee ID, first name and last name, the order ID, and the number of times to reach each combination of order ID. And I can actually come now here and I could just copy it from here and put it here. I will remove the comments and I only need to change this resident temp4 table What's your problem? Sorry, don't need this here. And since this is our final table, we will call it work, and I can drop table temp4, and I'm back where I was before. I will make a reload, and if I go to the diagram, I have my work table with my divider, and I have my rows duplicated. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you on the other ones, on the next ones, where I will share more stories of customers' irregular requests. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.